Hi, welcome to Learning English with Prose. This is the channel where we draw on many years of university experience to provide you with reliable information on the English language and handy hints on how to improve your English.
Hi, I've been deliberately vague about the definition of phraseology and collocation so far, but I'll try to remedy that deficiency in this video. But I'd like to start with something far more general. This is an excerpt from a regular column in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which shows us that phraseology is actually pervasive. It's not only used in everyday conversation, as we can see here, where we all use phrases like good morning and so on, but there may also be phraseologisms or phrasemes that are used in particular professions, for instance. So a psychotherapist, as portrayed here in Meyers Berufsphrasomat in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, saying something like, was sehen Sie, wenn Sie die Augen schließen? Or was macht das jetzt mit Ihnen? Es geht die Annahme der Welt in ihrem So-Sein. Or a doctor saying, this is more of a caricature perhaps, the first sentence, na, wie geht es uns denn? I don't think any self-respecting doctor would say that these days. Oh, das gefällt mir aber gar nicht. Or am besten klären wir das labordiagnostisch ab. These latter phrases are probably more likely to be used still in real life. So these are phrases that can be mind-bogglingly difficult for the translator to handle, because it will be quite difficult to ferret out real equivalents in the foreign language, in this case English. You'd have to search through large corpora, perhaps of medical series, hospital series, and so on, to be able to find adequate equivalents. Here are my suggestions, tentative suggestions. Was sehen Sie, wenn Sie die Augen schließen? What do you see when you close your eyes? Was macht das jetzt mit Ihnen? What does that do to you? Es geht die Annahme der Welt in ihrem So-Sein. It's about accepting the world as it is. Na, wie geht es uns denn? How are we today? That's obvious. Oh, das gefällt mir aber gar nicht. I don't like that at all, or I don't like the look of that at all. Am besten klären wir das labordiagnostisch ab. Let me schedule you for some tests, or we need to run some tests. I'll send you for some tests. So we can see that the idiom principle really reigns supreme in all walks of life, we might say. Doctors, some doctor must have come up with one of these phrases, must have been the first to come up with one of these phrases, and then it was adopted by other doctors who passed it back into the community in a slightly altered way, and so on. So these phrases, they don't appear out of thin air in a puff of smoke. They're passed on, handed down from generation to generation in only slightly altered ways. So one thing we've learned already is that translation restricts our ability to move laterally, to go sideways, if you like, and that's one of the hardest problems in translation. Unlike writing, where you can always find an alternative formulation, in translation, if you're faced with a particular phrasing, you need to find the exact equivalent in the other language. So some phrasemes may be hard to translate. In this session, you'll also learn to distinguish between the notions of collocation and phraseology, and to distinguish between different types of phrasemes and collocations. So here are some rough and ready definitions of phraseme or phraseologism. We might define a phraseme as prefabricated expression, one that other language users have used before, you're just reusing it, and the whole of this expression is usually more than the sum of its parts. So it's a group of words which has a different meaning when they're used together from the one they would have if the meaning of each word were taken individually. Now, if you don't know that words have a special meaning together, of course, and this might be the case with Wie geht es uns denn heute, and so on, in the case of a doctor. A foreigner who comes from a language background where this kind of phrase is not used might not be able to recognize it as a phrase, and so might well misinterpret this kind of phrase. So that's the danger with phraseology. Collocation is usually easier to handle, and we can define it as a frequent word combination, a word A plus a word B plus potentially a word C, but usually collocations are limited to 2 words, and these 2 words must make sense on their own. So a confirmed bachelor, eingefleischter Junggeselle, is a collocation, but hotel followed by the preposition at, we would not normally consider that to be a collocation. Word combinations can be placed on a cline or a continuum. At the fixed end of this cline, we have concrete nouns, for instance. We saw that in the first session on equivalence. An apple, that's very easy to translate, Apfel. Or compound nouns like lady's smock, which is Wiesenschamkraut, slightly more difficult. A coking plant, we have that in the first session also, Kokerei. And then, of course, phraseology like keep off the grass, a ban you'll often find in front of an English lawn, betreten des Rasens verboten would be the correct rendering, or a book with 7 seals, that's taken from the Bible, ein Buch mit 7 Siegeln. At the center of this spectrum, of this cline, we have less fixed combinations that we called collocations. For instance, you can say comply with rules or regulations, or abide by rules or regulations, or comply with laws and so on, stick to a rule in more colloquial English and so on. So there's a little more variation here. At this center of the cline, and then at the other end of the cline, at the other extreme, we have what one might call free combinations. Although this notion is a little doubtful. Personally, I doubt that there's anything totally free in language. For instance, in the first example here, he prefers fish to meat. Of course, we have a particular valency pattern here that translators would need to be aware of. And in German, of course, this needs to be rendered idiomatically as mag lieber Fisch als Fleisch, rather than bevorzugt Fisch gegenüber Fleisch, which would be a rather literal rendering. Look at the sea, that may really be a free combination, assuming that look at always has objects that you contemplate. So condition of using look at is there needs to be an object that you can actually contemplate, but there are lots of things that we can see with our eyes, so look at the sea might be considered as a free combination. Blue eyes, yes, anything that's blue or that we perceive to be blue can be described as blue, so that's a free combination. There are dozens of different types of phraseology. Here I've just listed 8 of those, perhaps the 8 most common types of phraseology. The first type is formulaics, like keep off the grass, we've already seen that. Then there are routine formulae, like how are we, in the case of a doctor. Or in an academic text, you might find things like is it worth it's worth noting that, which in German has to be rendered as sei angemerkt das. So it's a fixed phrase in a specific context, very much like the phrases we had in Meyer's Phrasiomat at the beginning of this video. Could you give me a hand? A phrase that's used in colloquial English a lot. It's not about giving someone your hand, but obviously about helping someone. Or delete where not applicable. That's often used in administrative English. Nicht zutreffendes Streichen. So As you can see, of course, the renditions here are usually totally fixed. They're set expressions in German as well, and you have to work out what those set expressions are. Quotations, usually from famous books, Much Ado About Nothing, for instance, a famous play by Shakespeare, which was translated by Schlegel and Tieck as Viel Lärm um nichts, and that's the standard translation there. Proverbs, too many cooks spoil the broth, zu viele Köche verderben den Wein, that's similar in German. There's a whole set of proverbs, a large number of proverbs that are the same across European languages. Curiosity killed the cat. I don't think there's a clear equivalent here in German. 5 proper nouns. The Red Cross, obviously, that's das Rote Kreuz. 6 idioms. For instance, they really went to town on the Christmas decorations, which means, or translates as Sie haben nicht gespart daran. So it's not about going to town, and again, some translators might be misled here if they've never heard this idiom before and think it's about actually going into town. Or I think the olive branch will have to come from both sides. This, of course, is an offer of peace or something like that, not an actual olive branch, and you have to realize that. There are also cliches, which might also be described as idioms. To hit the glass ceiling, for instance, if you can't advance any further up the career ladder, you hit the glass ceiling. And finally, phrasal verbs. There are lots of these in English. They usually consist of a verb plus an adverb or a verb plus a preposition. For instance, you might keep something back, which is you won't tell something, you won't reveal or divulge something. Now this slide illustrates that some texts consist almost entirely of prefabricated language, of phraseology. This is the case with commercial correspondence, for instance, as we can see here. Phrases can be slightly varied, but usually they mean the same thing, they're just variants. We have received your inquiry. We were pleased to receive. We wish to confirm receipt of something. Your inquiry concerning, regarding something. We're delighted to offer you this quantity, etc. So this is an offer, a letter where a company offers another company something. In addition, we'll be glad. That's a kind of politeness formula, routine formula that indicates politeness. We'll be glad to grant a 10% introductory discount so that the total price would come to or would amount to. Our terms of payment are, and delivery will be made or delivery will be effected. So the entire text consists of phraseology, and if you're translating that sort of text, of course, you have to be very familiar with the terminology in that specific sphere of life or area. So now for a little typology of collocation. Obviously any kind of syntactic pattern can be used to form a collocation, but there are some patterns that are more common than others, which we have a few examples here. So for instance, the object, noun plus verb collocation is very common. To pay a visit, einen Besuch abstatten, to make a speech, Rede halten, to take or sit or do an exam, eine Prüfung machen in German, to achieve an aim or to bring down unemployment. To pay someone a compliment is another one where we have two objects, one indirect we might say and one direct object, a ditransitive construction to be precise. Then we have adjective noun collocations, a great age, heated criticism, habe Kritik, wide powers where we can't use the literal translation, the most frequent translation of power obviously, to render this into German, umfangreiche Kompetenzen, would be a possible rendition or ausgedehnte Machtbefugnisse. At all hours of the day, zu unmöglichen Zeiten, another adjective noun collocation. Then we have verbs plus adverbs very frequently to depend heavily on, stark abhängig von, or to lag badly behind, stark hinken. And adverb plus preposition. It happened somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago, where in German we can't say irgendwo zwischen, but we have to say vor etwa 100,000 Jahre. So these are the most common types of collocation, but there are others that you also need to be aware of. Now, to wind up for today, here's a little activity for you. Try to identify the different types of collocations and phrasings in this newspaper article from The Guardian, and also try to suggest translations. So I suggest you stop the video at this point, and we'll come back together in a minute. Okay, one of the first phrases you may have noticed is of mature vintage. Of course, vintage normally refers to wines, not to people, but it is sometimes used with reference to people, so this is not a phrase that this particular writer was the first to use. So of mature vintage. How might we translate that into German? Well, we would also think of something containing Reife, probably. Von einer gewissen Reife, which also keeps the ironic element. Then we have keep stamping their feet. Now, if you stamp your feet, that's behavior that's typical of children, usually angry behavior, and we could translate this literally into German, because German children behave similarly to British children, so there's not much difference here. Mit den Füßen stampfen. Gobble up all the birthday cake and still have cake left to eat. That's an allusion to the idiom, have your cake and eat it, of course, which is slightly paraphrased here as gobbling up the birthday cake, but you have to become aware of that reference, of course, to the idiom before translating it. Then we have to storm out, which is a phrasal verb, so to leave a room, for instance, in this case to leave the European Union at great speed, and slam the door behind them, to slam the door, to zuknallen. Then we have a phrase that's often used in newspapers to prepare a quotation, to introduce a quotation. As Dominic Grieve, the former Attorney General, rightly puts it, threatening to leave is the behaviour of a 3-year-old who says that they're going to hold their breath, another collocation, den Atem anhalten, if they do not get the toy that they want. So in a way this is an extended metaphor. The two first paragraphs are extended metaphors that play on this notion of politicians being like children. This theme is continued in the third paragraph, where Donald Trump gets mentioned, aged 72 3/4. This is an allusion to a book by Sue Townsend, which not all of you might know. Adrian Mole, aged 13 3/4, I think was the phrase. So it's part of that cultural baggage that every Brit carries around, but that you might not be aware of. So you can see how difficult these phrasings can be sometimes. Declaring a national emergency, that's a Notstand erklären, that's easy, it's a collocation. To get his way is more of a phrasing, it's more figurative. Sich durchzusetzen, seinen Willen durchzusetzen, seinen Willen zu kriegen, in more colloquial German, and so on. The main thing here was to identify the collocations, I haven't put too much effort into translating them here. Thank you for watching. See you next time.